Ruth chapter 3, verse 1. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law Naomi said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you'll be well provided for." Now, she's talking about marriage, and marriage should involve romantic love. Ephesians 5:25 tells us, "Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for you." In other words, husbands should be willing to give their lives for their wives, not out of a sense of duty, but out of a deep and abiding love, just as Christ gave his life for us. Romans 5:8, "But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." But that's not the only consideration a couple should have when they consider marriage. Naomi knows this. Naomi was resolved to now seek rest and security for her daughter-in-law through marriage. When she says find a home, she specifically means that Ruth should be settled and secure in a home with a husband. As a married woman, Ruth would be protected from exploitation or oppression. She would enjoy a sense of permanence, as marriage would provide an opportunity to have an heir to perpetuate the line of Elimelech. Now, Naomi herself doesn't seem to be concerned about romantic love one way or the other. Now, from our perspective, this seems kind of cold-hearted, but Naomi is actually doing the best she can for Ruth under the constraints of the culture they lived in. And to be fair, by this time, both Naomi and Ruth had time to come to know Boaz as a generous and godly man. So perhaps the romantic love part was already a done deal. Ruth and Naomi probably did a lot of talking about Boaz and to Boaz that simply isn't recorded here. Now, one thing we notice here is that Naomi is no longer depressed and feeling as if her life is without hope. She's more proactive than she had been a few months earlier, taking on the role of matchmaker. She's become an agent in God's gracious provision. When God works in our lives, we need to recognize this and go with it. To her credit, this is what Naomi is doing. Under God's approving hand, Naomi determines to transform Boaz's expressed interest in Ruth into its logical fulfillment. Now, from Ruth's point of view, remember that she had given up the possibility of remarriage in order to care for an aging Naomi. But because of God's grace in her life, marriage suddenly became a possibility again. Now, I should mention that God does not call on everyone to get married. The Apostle Paul covers that in 1 Corinthians 7. God can call on a man or a woman to remain single and still give them a joyous and fulfilling life in his service. But if it is his plan for two people to get married, as it was with Ruth and Boaz, then he will use that marriage to give them joy and fulfillment. Now, verse 2, this is Naomi still speaking. "Now, Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor." So Naomi begins to map out what Ruth needs to do to announce her willingness to consider marriage with Boaz. First, she has to find Boaz, who would be at what was called the threshing floor that evening. Now, the threshing floor wasn't a shed or a building or any place covered with a roof and surrounded by walls, but it was normally an open-air, circular piece of slightly elevated ground that was smooth, hard, and clean. Now, following the harvest, the sheaves of grain from the harvested fields were brought here to be trampled by oxen or broken down by threshing sledges, vehicles mounted on low runners. The winnowing was done right after sundown, when the evening breeze began to blow. This involved men tossing the grain into the air, and the breeze would blow away the chaff, the useless part of the plants, and the heavier grain would fall back to the floor. When this work ended, there was a feast to celebrate. This was the job Boaz and his men would be doing now that the harvest itself was over, so Ruth would know exactly where Boaz would be that evening. Verse 3, this is Naomi still speaking. "Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking." So Ruth would wash up and dress up. Her best clothes would, by definition, be something tasteful and modest according to the standards of the day. In fact, the same phrase for dressing up here is used in 2 Samuel 12:20, when David prepares himself for worship after the death of his son. So her intention is not to seduce Boaz, but to clearly indicate that she's no longer in mourning for her first husband and to make as good an impression as possible. And this is perfectly appropriate, though I'm not sure how necessary it was to make yet another good impression. Boaz had often seen Ruth while she was working hard in the field, so he must have seen any number of bad hair days. He was still obviously attracted to her. Now, she would then go to the feast that would be held after the harvest, but would remain out of sight. The clothes would include a cloak to warn off the evening chill, so in the dim light after sunset, she wouldn't be easily seen or recognized. Now, verse 4, Naomi still speaking. "When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. and then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. So from our cultural point of view, it does seem like maybe Naomi is suggesting that Ruth seduced Boaz, or that she's at least showing herself available for sex. But nothing in the passage supports this. This action would remind Boaz of his duty as a kinsman redeemer. Ruth would remove the edge of Boaz's outer garment from his feet and lie down at his uncovered feet. Now, touching and holding his feet was an act of submission. This was really a daring and dramatic action, and it would call for a decision on Boaz's part to be her protector and likely her husband. Now, for everything to turn out all right, a lot depended on how Boaz reacted to this, since it would be an opportunity for him to take advantage of Ruth if he chose to do so. But Naomi had complete confidence in his integrity. Boaz could be trusted to act responsibly. And as Boaz himself will say in a few more verses, Ruth was recognized by everyone as a woman of noble character. So Naomi was confident that Ruth wouldn't act inappropriately either. Also, Ruth is trusting that Boaz will not only respect Ruth's purity, but also that he will not reject her. Now, verse 5 and 6. I will do what you say, Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. So Ruth was a grown woman, and she knew that if Boaz wasn't an honorable man, this could turn out to be a very bad plan. But she trusts Naomi's judgment. Ruth is herself wise enough to accept counsel and advice from someone she trusts. Proverbs 24, for by wise guidance you can wage your war, and in abundance of counselors there is victory. And also by now she's probably confident that she could trust Boaz as well. So all this highlights just how incredibly important it is for Christians to act in a moral and honorable manner towards each other. We should know we can trust a fellow Christian if we approach him or her for help or advice. We should know that a fellow Christian will not act inappropriately towards someone no matter what the situation. A strong church that does God's work is one in which the believers in that fellowship act with love and honesty towards one another. Colossians chapter 3. Put on as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness and humility, meekness and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you must forgive. And above all these put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. The early church provides us with a great example of this sort of fellowship. From Acts chapter 2, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teachings and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So it always benefits us to obey God in this. We see that in the book of Ruth, because both Ruth and Boaz conduct themselves in a moral manner, because they act with kindness and love and self-sacrifice, because Boaz is going to act with respect towards Ruth rather than respond to temptation. God is going to give them what was a very rare thing in that day and age, a marriage relationship based on true love. Now verse 7. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. So the threshing floor was usually out in the open, so it was necessary for the owner or some trusty servant to keep watch over the grain. Boaz ate his supper and slept at the far end of the grain pile. Now Ruth follows Naomi's instructions. She's trusting in God to use Boaz to answer her needs and to protect her. Ruth came to him quietly and at night in order to spare him embarrassment if he decided he didn't want her as a wife or to be her full-time protector. Remember that Bethlehem is a small town. If Ruth approached Boaz openly and he rejected her, the whole town would know about it. Ruth would be embarrassed, and so would Boaz. So once again, we see an example of someone acting with consideration towards another over and above their own needs. From Proverbs chapter 11, a man who is kind benefits himself, but a cruel man hurts himself. Now, verse 7 in this chapter also says that Boaz had been eating and drinking and was in good spirits. While Boaz's feasting likely did include alcoholic drinks, it should not be assumed that he was drunk. The phrase he was in good spirits does not necessarily indicate drunkenness. And when that phrase does indicate drunkenness, the Bible always makes it explicit. For example, from 1 Samuel chapter 25, when Abigail went to Nabal, he was in the house holding a banquet like that of a king. He was in high spirits and very drunk. So the Bible takes care to tell us unequivocally when someone is drunk. It does not do so with Boaz. Also, his behavior towards Ruth in no way indicates drunkenness or being hungover. Verses 8 and 9. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." So when we met Boaz in chapter 2, he was speaking in calm, measured sentences. So we know here, when he just snaps out, "Who are you?" that he was really taken by surprise. He must have had a moment where he had no idea what was going on. Who is this person? Was he being robbed? But Ruth responds calmly and with respect and immediately lets Boaz know the full situation. Now Ruth overtly reminds him that he is a kinsman redeemer. She asks that he spread the corner of his garment over her. The words used here can be translated as the wing of her garment. In Ruth chapter 2, verse 12, Boaz had commended Ruth for seeking protection under the wings of God. Now Ruth is sort of turning this back on him, expressing the hope that Boaz will act as an embodiment of the Lord's character, hoping that he will be her protector, as required by the laws of God. She's also making it clear that she wants to marry him. When marriages were solemnized among the Israelites, the man threw the skirt of his robe over his wife and covered her head with it. Exactly what Ruth is asking Boaz to do. So Ruth is asking Boaz for redemption. This is a parallel to which each of us had to do to become a Christian. We had to make the moral decision to go to Jesus and ask him to come into our lives. Romans chapter 10, if you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. From Matthew chapter 7, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives. He who seeks finds, and to him who knocks the door will be opened. So now there are some commentators who, in their zeal to present Boaz as a godly man, claim that Boaz felt no sexual temptation at this point. And that, of course, is just complete nonsense. Boaz woke up unexpectedly to find a beautiful woman asleep at his feet. Now, he's a guy, and all us guys, without exception, are pretty much complete swine in this area. Present us with a tempting situation involving a woman, and we will be tempted. But as we'll see, he responds to the situation as God would want him to, rather than responding to his own sinful nature. In 1 Corinthians 10, we are told, "No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will provide a way out so that you can endure it." So it should be noted that Boaz is a kinsman redeemer, but not the only one. We'll soon learn that there is a closer relative living in town. This means Boaz might have a legitimate out if he doesn't want to deal with Ruth by passing her on to another relative. So what will he do? We see that in the next verse. Verse 10. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after younger men, whether rich or poor. So Boaz is impressed with Ruth. He sees that she wasn't acting out of lust or greed, but she was reacting to Boaz's good character. She had trusted him not to take advantage of her. And we see here that she likes him for all the right reasons, that he's a godly man. And he likes her for all the right reasons. She's a godly woman. Again, he uses the phrase, "my daughter," a reminder of their age difference. He's commending Ruth for her continued kindness and self-sacrifice. She had first left her home for Naomi's sake. Now she's acting to provide Naomi with an heir. He commended her for not going after a younger man. He seems to believe that Ruth could have readily found such a match. He praised her for being willing to marry an older man in order to fulfill her commitment to her first husband, Mahlon, and the family name of Elimelech. Verse 11, Boaz still speaking. "And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. All the women of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." So Boaz then relieved any immediate fears Ruth might have by saying that he would do as she requested. He might have sensed that she was apprehensive over how he might interpret her bold proposal, so he immediately tells her that it's going to be okay, that he will take care of her. Now Boaz once again emphasizes that he knows of Ruth's propriety and morality. That's why he wants to be her kinsman redeemer. Ruth is known throughout the town as a hardworking, courageous, and loyal woman. Boaz knows he's hit a jackpot here. In Proverbs 31, it says, "A wife of noble character, who can find? She is worth more than rubies. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. Now, in verse 12, Boaz still speaking. Although it is true I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. So, although Boaz is Naomi's choice as Ruth's future husband, the laws governing the redeeming relative gave the closest eligible family member the first right of refusal. This is the kinsman that Boaz is referring to here. Now, it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that Boaz already knew this? Had he been investigating this to find out where he stood because he was already thinking that Ruth would make a great wife? But most importantly, Boaz wanted to do everything right. He wants to obey God's laws. Deuteronomy 25, if brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son he bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. So the law lays out the proper order for relatives to take up the responsibility of kinsman redeemer, with the intention of preserving a family name. There's a relative who's closer in line to Ruth's dead first husband than Boaz, so Boaz has to give him first shot. Boaz may only claim his right of redemption if the other redeemer is not willing. Now, verse 13, Boaz still speaking. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he's not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning. So this verse gives us more confirmation of Boaz's godly character. First, he makes sure Ruth is safe for the night. The term translates stay here is never used in the scripture in context of a sexual situation, so we know Boaz's intentions are honorable. He will not send her home alone in the dark, and he will not risk her reputation by letting people see him escorting her home. She's safe from physical danger. Remember, this is the time of Judges, when there was a lot of lawlessness in Israel, so a woman walking home alone at night is in danger. She's also safe from gossip that would strip away the good reputation she's built up. Those that gossip are not careful about facts. If Ruth is seen walking home from Boaz's place after dark, tongues will wag and assumptions will be made regardless of the facts. From Proverbs 17, an evildoer listens to wicked lips, and a liar gives ears to a mischievous tongue. And also we see that Boaz will marry Ruth only if God allows it. God blesses those in a strong marriage with personal happiness within that marriage. But the main purpose of marriage is to glorify God. Marriage represents the relationship between God and the church. From Revelation chapter 21, and then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming out of the heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. We, the church, are the bride, and God is our bridegroom. Any marriage between two Christians should be a reflection of that. That's the point of marriage. Now, Boaz obviously wants to marry Ruth. He now knew that she wanted to marry him. But Boaz would not go forward without God's approval. He will only take Ruth as his wife if he can do so while still obeying God. Now, he highlights his promise to Ruth with a vow directly to God. As surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. There's no doubt that Boaz will do everything he ethically could to bring Ruth into his home as his wife. But he will only do this if God approves of it. Jesus said in John 14, whoever has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him. Verse 14, so she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, no one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. So Ruth leaves quietly in the morning before anyone sees her. Once again, this is because Boaz didn't want anyone to misconstrue what had taken place. He was still concerned first and foremost for Ruth's welfare and reputation. He also didn't want to jeopardize the legal proceedings that would take place the next day with even the shadow of immorality. In verse 15, he also said, bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out. When he did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then he went back to town. And finally, Boaz once again demonstrates simple kindness by making sure Ruth and Naomi still have enough to eat. The harvest is over. Ruth could no longer provide for herself and Naomi by following behind the harvesters. So he just gave her some food. In addition to simply letting Ruth and Naomi eat something, This gift is also meant to be evidence for Naomi of his intention to redeem her and Ruth. Verse 16 and 17. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" So Naomi is understandably anxious to know what happened. Ruth gave her a full report and added that Boaz had given her the barley so that Naomi could share in Ruth's future fulfillment. The aged widow could now rest assured that she would not be forgotten in the future. Verse 18. Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what has happened, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." So Naomi tells Ruth to be patient and wait, and that's often the most difficult part of faith, when no more action can be taken and nothing remains but to wait patiently for God to work out his will. This is when doubts arise, and that's when anxiety creeps in. But God often does want us to wait. Jesus was 30 before he began his ministry. Moses was 80 years old before God gave him his big task. We always need to be willing to serve God on his schedule, not ours. Sometimes that means waiting. All the same, Naomi trusts that Boaz, the man of integrity, will act quickly to fulfill his oath. And as we're about to see, he does indeed act quickly. The faith of Boaz is one that leads to action. But he is not acting thoughtlessly, and he isn't driven by his own desires. He's acting morally and in a manner that he knows will be pleasing to God. Romans chapter 8 or chapter 12, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, which is good and acceptable and perfect." And Romans 8, "For those who are living according to the flesh set their minds on things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on things of the Spirit." That is chapter 3. The video for chapter 4 should be up soon.